All right, everybody, welcome again. Once again, my name's Conley. I'm one of the pastors here at Silicon Valley Reformed Baptist Church. Thanks for joining us. If you don't have a church currently and you're looking for one, I'd love it if you could come check us out. We worship every week on Sundays at 10 a.m. We have lunch afterward every week, and then we have an evening service also at 5 if you've already got a morning church and you'd like to check us out in the evening. We worship together every Sunday at 5 as well. Let's see. Don't think I have any special announcements, but each time that we do this, it's usually held on the last Friday of the month. Each time that we do this, we go through what the Word of God says on a particular topic related to marriage. And so each time it's a myth about marriage. This time the myth is public school is a good option for families. Decided to hit a spicy one today. You might wonder, why this particular one? Why not one having to do with being single or dating or something like that? I think it's real important to talk about marriage itself so that you have substantial things to talk about with marriage prospects, to see that you're aligned on views of family and views of raising kids and things like that. So it's important for even singles to think about the topic of parenting. Let me tell you a little bit about my own background. I went to public school for kindergarten. I then was homeschooled after that up until 8th grade. I went to 8th grade public school and finished high school and public school. So I've had a pretty big mix of both. I don't think that you generally have to have had a lot of experience on a topic in order to be able to speak credibly to it. But if anyone has had a mix of experience on both, it's me. I am qualified on this one. So what I want to talk about is the problems with public schooling, and then the biblical view of what child's education should look like. So first of all, what is it that parents should be trying to do in educating their child? I think one of the main problems that people have when thinking through this is they don't even understand what their primary objective should be. Most people, when they're thinking about this, they think the primary objective should be academically instilling information in the child so that they can get a job later. That's the main goal. That certainly should be one of the goals, but is it really the main goal, especially in the earlier years of childhood? Consider these verses. Proverbs 13:24, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Proverbs 29:15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Proverbs 29:17, discipline your son and he will give you rest. He will give you delight to your soul. Bible, when it talks about the education of a child, it usually talks about it in the term of character building or in terms of correction, right? These are the kinds of things the Bible imagines primarily when it comes to educating your child. Now, a school system is going to be able to give that to some degree. When your child acts up, there's going to be some level of correction, but there's not the kind of correction that a parent can give, especially if you believe the biblical instruction about the use of the rod. They're not going to give that kind of correction, and they shouldn't. Right? That should be something that the parent will be doing with the tender care of a parent. So, a lot of people just don't think about the main thing that they're trying to accomplish. They think, well, do I even have the academic credentials to be able to instruct a child? I was bad at math. How am I going to be able to get them through math? These are not the primary things that you should be concerned about. The primary things that you should be concerned about are instilling good character qualities in your child. You know, if you imagine someone was building a cannon, right, and they're lugging all this heavy equipment and they're setting it up, etc., and they're trying to make the best and most powerful cannon they can make, and then they're finally done and they realize it's pointed in the wrong direction. This is pointed at my castle. This isn't pointed out there at the enemies. The whole task of having built that cannon was wasted because you might have built something powerful, but you didn't build it in a way that its energies are going to be directed the right way. And this is how you should be thinking about raising a child. You want to make sure his energies are directed in the right way, not just that he or she has a lot of capacity to do things, but that those would be directed in the correct direction. Another thing the Bible talks about in line with character is corrupt influences. Let me give you a few more verses. 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived, bad company ruins good morals. Proverbs 13:20, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Matthew 18:6, well, let me save that one for a moment later, actually. So, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Now, if you went to public school system, no doubt you encountered bad influences, and maybe they had some degree of influence on you. And maybe you know people who would have done pretty well in life if they had not encountered a lot of corrupting influences in their early years. This is a really important thing to consider. And what I'm talking about doesn't just apply to public school. It also applies to things like private school, if you consider it. You know, a lot of people think that their kid's going to be really safe if they put them in Christian school. A lot of times what will happen, there's some kid that encounters corrupting influences in high school. They become pretty corrupt themselves. The parent pulls them out and puts them in the Christian school, so they think this is where they're going to be safe. But it turns out all the other parents were doing that too. And so it's where like the worst public school rejects are. Is anybody here, that they went to a Christian school and familiar with what I'm talking about? Talk to someone who went to a Christian school and they'll confirm there's a lot of that happens. It's a lot of people who ended up being exposed to a lot of the worst kind of stuff that ended up getting put in Christian school. So this Christian school isn't even really a perfectly safe thing either. Consider the weight of this. Matthew 18:6 says, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." So Matthew 18, talking about the severe penalty or the how bad it would be, how much better it would be for you to have a millstone cast around your neck and you thrown into the sea than to corrupt a little one. And yet many people willingly expose their children to all kinds of corruption, maybe ignorantly, maybe not ignorantly. But this is something you should be avoiding at all costs, exposing your children to corrupting influences. The next thing is, now everything I've said before all applies a little bit to private schools as well, but going on to something that's more particular to public schools and wouldn't apply to Christian schools, false teaching. Colossians 2:8 says, "See that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." So you are to guard yourself and those in your care against corrupt philosophies that would lead you in the wrong direction. Now, anyone who's been through public school or anyone slightly familiar with the system knows that it's full of all kinds of false teaching. It doesn't matter which area of teaching either. You know, in the sciences, they end up teaching that, well, it's not sin that brought death into the world. Rather, death existed and was part of the shaping of creation, well, not creation, but life for a long time before humanity came about, right? And so you undermine the foundation of the gospel by teaching an evolutionary view of the world where death is coming in before the fall. You look at other areas and they're teaching all kinds of sexual ethics to children. This is not something that is just new either. When I was in high school, so back in 2003, I remember being taught transgender theory, right? I had fellow classmates who were taking classes about this, and they were in group sessions sharing reports about this, explaining the difference between gender and sex, etc., right? So this is not just, a lot of people think of that as something that just started happening in 2015. I've been exposed to this. I got exposed to this in public school a long time ago. And consider other subjects. Literature, there's all kinds of depraved ideas I got exposed to in my literature class. Just all kinds. History, that's going to be written from a particular point of view that sees man as fundamentally good and sees the power of government as being used in a good way to shape man in a way that would be contrary to what Scripture says. I won't go too deep into that right here, but suffice it to say, if it's the government that's providing the school system, certainly they are going to have opinions on what the history taught says about government. So those are all things to consider. And to give you one more illustration about how this just affects everything, you know, doesn't matter if it's, I mean, even math in some ways, but I took a film class when I was in high school, and my film teacher, who was the guy who wrote Logan's Run. Anybody know that movie, like an old 80s sci-fi movie? He wrote the film script in the book, Logan's Run. And he had us all write these short film scripts. And so I wrote this short one about, it was some absurdist thing about two men arguing over a Play-Doh hot dog and microwaving it, right? It's really meaningless. I just kind of did this as a joke. He had me come up and read this in front of the class, and so I read it in front of the class. He says, now tell us what it means. And so I start to make something up, right? I think I'm just going to make something up here. And I start to explain it, and he goes, no, wait, stop. Never explain your art. And he made everybody else explain what it meant. You know, teaching postmodern relativism right there. It doesn't matter what it really means if it has any kind of objective meaning. It's up to you to decide what things mean, etc. Right? And these are fundamentally undermining the truth that God has given. So
you mentioned it infiltrating math.
Yeah, right, math. Yeah, so let me see if I can think of some better examples by the end, and I'll come back to that one. So if this, so a lot of times people will point to public schools and say, well, that's true about some public schools, but not the public school I send my kids to. Around here, I don't think many people would make that argument, but I have heard that a lot. Consider this. The Bible says about government that it is, in Romans 13:4, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Okay, so this describes the task of government to be an avenger, right? He carries out justice on the wrongdoer. This is what it explains when it gives the foundation of government in Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds blood, by man his blood shall be shed. But what's happening with the public school system? That's not retributive justice that's described by the Bible. It's social justice, right? It's bringing people up out of poverty, using the funds taken by neighbors to lift other people up out of poverty. That's not retributive justice. That's not whoever sheds whoever sheds blood by man, his blood shall be shed. That's not the sword. That's a scalpel, right? A lot of people see government as a doctor designed to fix problems, rather than seeing them as a wielder of the sword designed to punish. The systems around here, the justice systems, are often called corrective systems because they see that as being their purpose. That's not the biblical purpose. The biblical purpose is not to correct, it is to punish. And so they step out of their role, and what are they fundamentally doing? They're fundamentally replacing the family. So consider these quotes. Horace Mann, who is the father of American public education, he says, the state is the father of children. John Dewey, who's a famous public school advocate, said, what the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all of its children. Now that sounds fine on the surface, but the idea there is that whatever is best, only one set of parents wants that. The rest of the parents need to be corrected, and the whole community needs to provide it instead because they're not sufficient, right? Only the best parents are capable. The other parents are not capable or qualified to raise their children. Arne Duncan, who was the U.S. Education Secretary under Obama, he said, and so we have to think of education as a shared responsibility, not just teachers, not just principals, but parents, school boards, superintendents, states. Right? So he says this is a shared responsibility. It's not just parents. It's all these other institutions too that share this responsibility of educating. Hillary Clinton famously said there's no such thing as other people's children, and this is often repeated by educators. Right? You can look up this quote on YouTube and you'll find a bunch of educators using this quote. They'll say, there's no such thing as other people's children. In the classroom, there are children. The idea is that the family needs to be replaced. The family can't do a good enough job on this on their own. But the Bible has said the family does do a sufficient job. But before moving on to that, let me answer about how it might infiltrate math. The notion of chance. I actually talked about this last time at the last singles dinner. The notion of chance is not a biblical idea, and that needs to be explained to people. Or rather, if you're to use the notion of chance, that's just common parlance for things that we don't totally understand about the world that God has placed us in. Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot is cast in the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So all things being determined by God indicate why this is true. All of math comes from the very nature of God himself being truth. And so all those things are kind of underlying foundations for math that don't get taught. And so math, usually you're just skipping those things, so it's not as dangerous as the other subjects where something is very explicitly being given to replace the foundation. It's just being taught without that foundation, that God is the one who determines what we call chance. God is the one who is truth itself that determines the law of math. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Meaning like randomness and chance doesn't actually exist, but math is based off of.
Yeah, so chance is one of the things that you would look at in mathematics, right? If you study combinatorics and things like that. And if you just approach that as though, oh, this is just one of the features of the world, and it's some force that exists outside the universe, but is not God himself who is determining all things, then you are intentionally kind of passing over that foundation. Whereas ideally, a Christian parent would tell their child that math is true because God himself is true, right? And he is logical, he is orderly, and he is sovereign. He's determined all things. That's why that's why things come to pass, not just because of some pagan notion of chance, for example. We can come back to it in Q&A if that wasn't enough.
To me. I like the idea though.
So parental responsibility. These things belong to the family. They shouldn't be replaced by the state. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Deuteronomy 6:6-7, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and even when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Now, how can you do that if you're not around your child, if your child's not around you, if your child's not around the home? Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The responsibility in all of these is for the parents, right? And it's the parents' responsibility to provide that education. Okay, so one is providing the education. The other is, in ideal circumstances, you're actually the one giving it, right? And so what I mean by providing is like financially providing for it as opposed to your neighbors providing for it. And then secondly, what I mean is actually doing the educating, which in some circumstances it might make sense. Okay, you're a single parent, you need to rely on some others to help you with this task because it's not something that you can do yourself, etc. But we should see that as rare circumstances, not the norm that God has intended. The norm that God has intended is for this to be the parent's burden to bear. And you realize that if the Bible has specified how the home should be run, in 1 Timothy 5, Titus 2, speaking of the importance of a wife building up her home and making her home, it makes sense that there would be the capacity to do these things. This isn't a heavy burden that people can't bear. This is something that generations all around the world have done for thousands of years, is raise their own children and educate their own children. So how should you approach dating then with this kind of thing in mind? First of all, if you don't have conviction about this already, it's something to look into. And if you do have conviction about this, it's something where it's worth keeping your eye on how you would go about educating your children. Maybe it's worth looking into what kind of curriculums exist, what kind of difficulties are there with homeschooling and stuff like that, so that when you get to that point where you are raising children, it's not something that is so far, it's not something that's completely new to you. You've had a little chance to expose yourself to that. And then also when you talk to a marriage prospect, you can discuss these things and see eye to eye. A lot of people go about dating very unintentionally without talking about some of the important things they need to talk about what their life's going to look like, what their view for the family is. And if this is part of your view for the family, which children education ideally would be, you will talk about these things. So those are my encouragements for you. And consider, like I always do at the end of every of these, like taking a step back and looking at what the gospel has to say about this, what the way that Christ has saved us has to say about this, given that human marriage is supposed to reflect the union between Christ and the church. Isaiah 54:13 says, all your children shall be taught by the Lord, and great shall be the peace of your children. This is speaking to Zion, the idea being this marriage between Zion and the Lord. In the New Testament, Zion is said to be the church, right? Between the church and Jesus Christ. That union is one that is taught by those two, right? They are not Like the church is the pillar and buttress of the truth. Christ is teaching us by his word. This is not something that is being offloaded to other sources. Now, sometimes it is, unfortunately. Sometimes churches do offload a lot of teaching. They relegate more and more things to the outside world as being outside of our competency, outside of what the Bible speaks. People dealing with all kinds of problems like depression, anxiety, etc., right? A lot of people see that as, oh, I need a professional to talk about that, So sometimes it is offloaded by the church to others, but that's not what it's supposed to be. The view of the Bible is that the church and Christ are teaching their children directly about those things that they are to be taught in. And this is what the home should look like, father and mother teaching their children directly in ideal circumstances, but never relying on someone else to provide that. At least involuntarily. Charity is good, but forced charity is something different. Forced charity by the power of the sword is something different. All right, let me go ahead and pray first there. Dear Heavenly Father, I know that this is a topic that causes a lot of controversy. I pray that you would help us to think through these things biblically and that you would bless our discussion this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to go ahead and do the Q&A now. For any questions, all right, everybody, if you can settle down for a minute. We're going to do Q&A now. For any questions, my son Ford is going to pass around the microphone so that you can be recorded. All right. So I forget your name. Brad. Okay. Yeah, we're starting Q&A now. All right. Anybody have any questions? Yes, Jesse.
My name is Jesse. I'm curious if are you advocating that every Christian household should be homeschooling their kids?
So I said that there are some cases where, where you have a single parent or something like that, and I understand enlisting the help of others, like a Christian school or something like that. I am opposed to public school as an option altogether, because I do not believe that it's right to allow the government to force your neighbors to pay for your kids' education, which is what's happening in public education.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you say that last part again?
Okay, so what happens in public education is not you going and paying for your child's education. It's your neighbors doing it by the force of the government. The government says you have to pay these property taxes. You'll get in a lot of trouble if you don't, and all those go to send kids to school, right? I've got 9 kids. None of my kids benefit from that, but I pay a darn lot in property taxes. So it's not right for them to take money from some and give it to others. But that's what most taxation is right now. Very little of it is supporting the justice system, which is what God intended for the government to be.
So what does the community helping pay for education for all have to do with the bulk of your message of the bad influence and negative environment that children are exposed to in the public system?
Well, part of it is independent. I'm giving an additional reason, but there is a relationship there in that a lot of what is taught when it comes to history and things like that are coming because, there's a certain organization that's giving money to that group, right? You can't, and this is why there are a number of colleges that don't accept public funds, because they know that if they accept public funds, then they'll have to implement whatever is handed to them in exchange for continuing to get public funds. So sometimes there is a connection, but that's not how I was presenting it. I'm just saying here's an additional reason, and this is the one that I consider to be the most important in some ways. Not necessarily the most important for making sure your children are brought up well, but the most important to make sure you are honoring God and not essentially taking from your neighbor so that they are supporting your kids rather than you supporting your own children.
So you would be last one. So you would be more in favor of public schools if the parents paid directly based off of how many kids they are sending to public school?
Right, they wouldn't be called public schools at that point. Right, they would be private because it's not the public that's paying for them. That's what public generally means. I mean, you could have a charity school, right? You could have a school that's funded by a charity that's available to the public, and that could be called a public school. But what most people mean when they're talking about a public school is something that's paid for by the public, not voluntarily, not at their will, but the public is paying for it.
So you're more in favor for private schools?
Yes. Yeah. All right, any other questions? And it can be about other things related to marriage, dating, and stuff like that. It doesn't have to be just about education, schooling.
Okay. Does this work?
Yeah,
Okay.
this is just for the recording.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was curious. What else do you know about? Because you brought up some good historical examples of the public school system. I do a lot of study on my own as well. Horace Mann and John Dewey. I'm curious what you think about the origins of the school system, because I have my own ideas about it, I guess. And
Yeah, I've gotten some books. It's funny, a lot of the history books I get, I ask my wife to read and summarize for me. So I have a couple of public school books on the origin of public school system that I've asked her to summarize for me, and they didn't seem to have a whole lot of information. So I don't feel like I'm very well educated on it. But yeah, my opinions are founded on principles that don't really matter what the history of it is exactly. Okay. But anyway, yeah.
for sure.
Yeah,
a
I'd love
little
to
bit controversial
exchange
too.
thoughts.
So
Yeah,
that's why
yeah.
I'm just bringing it up.
Yeah, it's hard to find people who speak on these things because you will get castigated if you do as any kind of public figure. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Another
yeah, I'd be
question?
happy to exchange thoughts with you later.
Another question.
Yeah.
I guess for the second question about like what kind of education would I like, or maybe as a Christian community, we could like to see. And I think the idea of like teaching kids to work with one another instead of, my main thing with school is that I see the problem is that they put kids into like this individual format, and it's like fighting against one another who's next to you, instead of like collaborating and building together and creating things that maybe make previous paradigms of living kind of obsolete, so we can move into like a new wave of living. It kind of keeps us, I think it keeps them really trapped, and keeps a lot of pressure on them just to be able to parrot back the answers for a test, and
Right.
and then it goes in one ear and it goes out the next, the next week when it's not needed anymore, and it's not really building kind of what you're talking about, like a character building and like a sense of community.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So hopefully a parent's going to be more concerned about the individual to teach them rightly. But then there's other factors too. If you're exposed to kids of different age ranges like you would be in a home, as opposed to public school where it's just all kids exactly your age, then you don't have the kind of dynamics where you're learning to help others, you're interacting with those who are more mature than you, et cetera, right? I think those are kind of important things of growing up that, the system that takes them all by exact age slices doesn't help with. So there's a lot of factors. Yeah.
Oh yeah, a good author to look into is John Taylor Gatto. He was actually a New York school teacher, and he was I think they even awarded him like the teacher of the year in New York one time. But he had a really different idea with the model of schooling and how it should be. And like at one point in time, he would let his students actually leave the classroom back in the 80s and the 90s. And like one of them was interested in swimming, so he let this girl go to all the public schools in New York City and do like tests on the pool and stuff like this, and create like a manual and stuff. And then he eventually got to the point where he couldn't make up like excuses for why his kids weren't in the class anymore, and he had to retire. And he just went like full time making books and doing videos and stuff. So that's someone cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's pretty interesting. The U.S. is a state or a place where we have enough freedom to homeschool. There are some countries where it's illegal, like Germany. Yeah. You have to give your kid to the state. Right. Okay. Any other questions? They can be about the Bible in general. It can be really, I'll take anything. Yeah, go for it.
So if a Christian household chooses to homeschool their children based off of the negative influences that you've been talking about, so they do that through elementary school, and then they say, well, high school is corrupt too, we'll keep them for high school. But then there's college, and oh my gosh, there's philosophy classes and just this huge range of options in classes, and even apparently the Christian schools have their problems. Are they supposed to just keep homeschooling through college? And then what happens after college? oh my gosh, the kid's gonna get a job at a secular job, and then they're gonna have to be faced with influences there. Like, I'm just trying to understand, like,
Well, it's kind of hard to imagine a kid getting a job. So at some point they stop being kids, right? At some point they're adults and it's no longer your responsibility to shelter them. At some point it is your responsibility to shelter them and you take that responsibility seriously. At a certain point it ceases to be their responsibility. I do think that public schools, even colleges, have corrupting influences. I have concerns about that as well. And I don't think that every kid needs to go to school like a lot of people think, or needs to go to college. There's a lot of jobs that don't require it, and there's a lot of ways to learn that don't involve that too. But no, at some point they're adults, and that's not and the concern is not to.
What I'm getting at is, are you really preparing them for the inevitable time where they're going to have to face a secular world? The analogy I'm thinking in my head is, you have a kid and you're like, hey, eventually you're going to have to learn to swim. There's a pool, but I'm going to keep you over to the side. And the kid grows up and you're like, eventually you're going to have to swim, but not today, and I'm protecting you. And then eventually they get old enough, it's like, okay, now you're an adult, and suddenly, push, like they're shoved into the pool, and you're like, not my problem. I raised them as best as I could, and now they're on their own, and lo and behold, they don't know how to survive in that
Well,
environment.
I mentioned that I was homeschooled and then went to 8th grade, right? And I had to look back at that experience, and I don't think, oh, I wasn't prepared enough for it. I think I should have been prepared further for adulthood by having been protected for a few more years. Yeah, none of that is... Kids will encounter things that you can teach them through. They will encounter enough stuff without being exposed to the vast sea of filth that exists out there, right? You don't have to introduce your kids to pornography. You don't have to introduce your kids to... Like, you can tell them about these things, right? But they don't have to be exposed to them. You know, and my kids, I tell them about this stuff all the time. We have twice daily family worship where we read the Bible together and I explain it to them, and we talk about all the difficult passages. You know, even, first few chapters of Proverbs are just all about avoiding the adulterous woman, right? These are things I explain to my kids. And anything they want to know about, they can ask me. And when they have friends who do expose them to things, which isn't ideal, they come to me and I'm able to talk to them about it. I don't think that we need to expose them to much more than what they're already encountering. Yeah. Yes, Stacy.
Do you think kids in homeschool should use the internet? Like, what kind of safeguards do you think Christians should implement for their kids using the internet in schools, in homeschool?
Right, that's a really good question. I don't have great answers. So I was raised at a time when the internet was really popular. It had already become really popular at that point. And I was in a home where my father was concerned enough about that we didn't have the internet. And I look back at that with a lot of gratitude. I see that almost all of my peers, struggled with pornography at some point. This is not something that I had to struggle with, right? And it kept me pure for adulthood and everything. And and these are things that I wasn't taking baggage into adulthood, right? So I'm thankful for that. Now today, what I do with my kids is I use Chromebooks because they have, because you pretty much only have a web browser, and then you can do filtering whitelist, where you can just explicitly say which sites they're allowed to watch or allowed to go to, and then any ones that they go to, they can just request and that'll pop up. So I found that the easiest thing. The difficult thing is, because I'm a software engineer and I want to teach my kids this, it requires a broader access that can't be so hampered. So what I do with those circumstances, and when I'm teaching them those things or when they're working on those things, they're working on a computer that's in a public space next to me or Sarah. So that's how I personally deal with it. Hopefully there are better solutions in the future, but those are what I use. Yeah. Welcome. All right, any other questions? Jesse, go for it. Yeah, somebody else raise your hand if you don't want Jesse to hog it.
So, you talked a lot about in my opinion, the vilification of the public school system.
Yeah.
So, extending that logic and that argument to the teachers. So, I mean, there were some teachers at the table. My parents were both
Sure.
high school teachers. They're essentially, in your opinion, the extension of logic would say they are accepting money
Yeah.
in exchange for teaching in this vile, corrupt system.
Right.
So, as a teacher or someone who personally I felt like I benefited from my parents as teachers,
Sure.
why shouldn't we find that offensive?
Yeah.
In that extension of an argument of basically saying you're accepting money in exchange for building up this evil, vile system.
Yeah, I understand. There's a hagiography around teachers, right? If you don't know the word hagiography, that's like the study of sainthood. There's a hagiography around teachers where they're praised as just being the best people ever. And so to say anything negative is seen as a really jerk move. But simply put, the money is ill-gotten. It does not belong to the government to redistribute to others. They have the right to take taxes for the retributive justice system. That is what God has authorized. That is why the government wields the sword. They wield the sword. They don't wield the chalkboard or the chalk, right? They're wielding the sword. And so for them to use that for purposes that God hasn't given them, to raise money for all kinds of things that are not what God has instructed them to do, is beyond their authority. It doesn't matter how nice and what kind of face you paint on it, it is still wrong. And it's still wrong for those who participate in the system, even at the bottom levels, that have very good intentions. And I know they have good intentions. So I'm not personally objecting to their motives. I'm just saying that it's a inherently wrong system because parents are to provide for their own children's education, or if it's to be provided for by charity, it should be voluntary charity, not involuntary charity.
So you're saying it's not the role of government to force people to give them money that's going to be redistributed for a role, which is education, redistributing that money towards taking the education obligation away from the parents.
Right, yeah, they're subverting the family. This is the task for the family. They're taking it on themselves as their own task. Yeah.
And so then any teacher that is then accepting that money is maybe doesn't have bad intent, but
right.
They're sinful.
Yeah, I think that they should not take that money. That's right. Yeah.
So how do you view society? Well, no, I don't
Yeah, go ahead. Brad's next. Hey, Ford, can you take it to Brad first? Yeah, Brad and then Joe, and then what's your name? What's your name, ma'am? Stephanie. Stephanie. Okay. Great.
All right. Yes. Thank you for hosting this event. It's a wonderful event. I've been to it 3 times now. And regarding your subject matter, I didn't quite get your name, sir. Jesse. My name Brad. And it brought up a subject matter that me and another guy, he worked for something at some college in Oregon. It was the men's health department or something like that, or men's academic department. And he was saying, he's like, what? Because I was asking your same questions. I was like, this reminds me of a conversation I was having with someone at college. And I said, what if you became a millionaire or billionaire like Elon Musk or the inventor of Facebook, and you dropped out of school? Would that question arise for someone who's a proponent of why the teachers are needed? Because I asked them the same question. I said, if someone gave me $1 million or $1 billion to drop out of school, I'd do that in a minute. To go live out my fantasy if the $1 million is still what it is 7 hours ago. And then I wouldn't have no need for school. That's from a perspective of knowing where your teachers are coming from or knowing who your teachers are. Because obviously they're just like, oh, we're not going to sit here.
Sorry, do you have a question?
Oh,
yes. We got to keep this
Oh,
moving.
okay. Yes. Well, I was just trying to
I want to give people
them
time
context.
to mix. Sure.
I was going to say, even though that we're talking about schooling, where is the educators of, like you said, financial independence? Sure, the teachers and everything, they're all doing, a given job or scenario. I'm not going to down them too much. But the fact that where is the ones who invented this whole scenario regarding getting money for things that you need that supposedly was created all out of nothing? And so that's why I was going to add my my statement to that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just been a system that's been building up over a long time, bit by bit. I don't know all the origins of the history of it. Yeah.
Well, I like that word, origins.
Sure. Sure. Let's take it to Joe. Is it Joe? Joel. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the role of government with education is that in a democratic society, being educated is a necessity so that people can be intelligent about when they're voting
Right.
in public elections.
Yes. Yeah, so it's good for people to be educated so they can vote well. Parents should be doing that.
Especially, Ben was talking about like the history of education. There was a time when, everybody was an immigrant. Like a large portion of society was an immigrant, from different countries. So, even more so, the children needed to be educated. They were coming from different cultures, different education to be kind of a standardized American
Right.
indoctrination.
Yeah, the fact that it has some good effects doesn't change the fact that it's the responsibility of parents and it's not the responsibility of government. It doesn't matter if you say that, well, it'd be better for democracy, et cetera. No, I don't think it is. I think it's much better for democracy if parents are teaching them, and not the same office that is funding the education is also the one in power that, wants their votes. I mean, that's kind of the thing, is kids are being taught that currently what's going on is right, et cetera. And so they think, oh, all these systems, et cetera, are right. All of us here, or most of us here, are the product of the public school system. And so part of the reason we believe that a lot of the system is right is because it was taught to us that it was right, because of course they are. They're getting the money from the system. And so you could point to this and show the opposite too, right? That it's kind of perpetuating the corruption. If it's the same institution that is in power that is deciding what the education is and deciding who gets funded for it. Let's take it to Stephanie. Yeah.
So hi, I'm Stephanie. I just thank you very much for putting this on.
Yeah, welcome.
And the food was great. I have a lot. Going
Sure.
on in my head right now. Which I'm not going to be able to say eloquently. I think I am like diametrically opposed to a lot of what you're saying.
Sure.
I'm a Christian. I grew up in a Christian house. I worked as a social worker for a decade. And so I saw things, certainly, I think there's a lot of bloat in government, but I think there are several things that are good about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I appreciate that we can come and have this discussion, and that we live in a country where, we can have these views. And I think it's really unfortunate because we're so polarized these days politically. Like, I am telling you, man, it was like, I don't get up, don't jump up and race out. I was like, but I really do appreciate that point of view, and that's where I'm going to stop there.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that the government, when it does these social functions, when it does social justice rather than retributive justice, can't do some good things. My point is that is not their job, and they are not authorized by God to use the power of the sword to accomplish those things. So I'm not saying they can't do any good. I'm saying that they are not authorized to do any of that good. Yes. Let's make this the last one so that you all have time. Yeah.
So are you ultimately advocating that schools shouldn't exist?
Schools? No, I think schools should exist. I think that there would be a lot less of them if parents were typically taking it into their own hands. I think there's reasons for people to use private schools in cases where, for example, like I said, single parent homes. There are cases where maybe there's a school who provides an extra special kind of trade education for younger adults or kids, right? There's all kinds of things where there might be like special reasons, but I don't believe it should be the norm.
So private schools are okay because you are directly paying for your kids' education.
Yeah.
So if every education system we had under your system was privatized, how do you care for and bring up the poor and the minorities and the underprivileged and make sure that they don't just keep perpetuating cycles of
Sure.
poverty?
So if you look at the money that's spent, if you look at the money that's spent per student in public education, I forget what it is. It's some huge amount. It's 20,000, 10,000, or 20,000 per student. What's required for that's per year. What homeschooling, much cheaper. People usually do it for under $1,000 a student, if not much less. You would save so much money. That money wouldn't cease to exist. It would still exist. It would exist with the home. People would have the capacity to be charitable, and the charity would be real charity because it would come from the heart, not from some institution forcing it. And like Jesus said, you'll always have the poor among you. We were supposed to care for the poor, we individually, not someone else on our behalf making us do it. We were supposed to care for the poor. And part of the reason that I get so passionate about this and I care about this is because I have a heart for the poor and want to care for the poor. And I know that that job is being taken from me when it belongs to me to care for the poor. And I have less capacity to because I have less money for it, because it's being taken.